Europe's reliance on Russian gas has become painfully clear with the devastating attack on Ukraine. Unable to decouple, Europe is still sending billions of dollars to Moscow, which is inevitably prolonging the conflict. Can a belated push to phase out oil imports speed up Europe's transition to a green economy? And is it time for Germany to crank up its nuclear power? Europe may have ambitious plans for climate neutrality, cutting emissions by 55% by 2030. But it could do with bringing forward those plans as Europe's consumers pay a heavy price for the energy crisis. That crisis was long in the making, even before Russia's attack on Ukraine. Its addiction to Russian oil and gas is blunting the sanctions imposed on Vladimir Putin by filling the Kremlin's coffers. In response, the European Commission is doubling down on its green transition. It is time we tackle our vulnerabilities and rapidly become more independent in our energy choices. Let's dash into renewable energy and lightning speed. Well, that's the EU Green Deal chief, Frans Timmermans. He goes on to say renewables are a cheap, clean and potentially endless source of energy. Instead of funding the fossil fuel industry elsewhere, they create jobs here. Putin's war in Ukraine demonstrates the urgency of accelerating our clean energy transition. So how does Europe replace the 155 billion cubic meters of gas, or 40% of the gas that it gets from Russia? And can Europe speed up the green transition? Let's find out with our panel from London. Paul Ekins, Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at University College London. From Berlin, we're joined by Maria Pastukhova, Senior Policy Advisor at E3G. And we're also in Berlin. We're joined by Thomas O'Donnell, an energy and geopolitical analyst. Welcome to you all. I want to start with you, Paul Ekins. It does seem to be a very challenging situation that Europe finds itself in, particularly Germany. How did we get here? Does this demonstrate a lack of strategic thinking?
In hindsight, it definitely does. Of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing to have. And going back 5 or 6 years, I don't think anyone was envisaging that we were going to be in the current situation. Perhaps we should have thought that that was possible following the Russian annexation of Crimea and the partial occupation of other parts of Ukraine. But certainly people didn't foresee that. And of course, the strategy of Germany, particularly to engage with Russia and to get quite dependent on energy and gas, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, in hindsight, that was not a very wise thing to do.
It wasn't. Let me come to you now, Maria Pastukhova. I saw you nodding along there with the idea that Germany really had got itself into this trap, becoming so dependent on certainly one country for the bulk of its energy. I mean, how does the country even start to think about replacing that supply, particularly in such a short space of time?
Well, let's say the country should have started thinking about diversifying its energy supplies, so not necessarily to other gas sources, but to maybe other energy sources long time ago. The problem with Germany has been that the German industry has in fact built itself on the access to cheap Russian gas for decades, and is partly its competitiveness is partly due to the access to this gas, what it has been at least up until now. German industry now faces, of course, a big challenge of changing from dependency on cheap Russian gas to some other energy fuels. And other gas sources are not cheap on the global market and are very likely to remain quite expensive for the years to come. So what Germany now needs to do, and as I said, this is already some years too little too late, is really to look into the means to decarbonize the most vulnerable sectors that are dependent on the imports of Russian gas the most. And these are, first of all, residential heating and industrial heat and heating of industrial buildings. There are solutions Germany, in fact, is already working on. One of them is the massive ramp up of heat pumps across all of the heating in the country, but much more needs to be done.
Let me turn to you now, Thomas O'Donnell. Is there not a danger that by moving away from gas in one sense, I notice there's a big push now for electric cars, electric this and electric that, and you still need something to generate the electricity from somewhere. Do you still think that countries aren't perhaps bringing that strategic thinking into to forward planning for the challenges ahead? We're in this challenge now. It's going to take an awful lot of effort to get out of it. But do you feel that lessons are getting learned about tackling energy dependence and diversity as we move forward?
You're asking me a big question, and maybe I agree with what both my colleagues here, Peter and Maria, have said, but you're talking about if something's been learned geostrategically. I would just step back a little more. I would say that the German leadership, going back decades, was very geostrategic. This was their conscious geostrategic plan. I mean, now business had other ideas, different people had different ideas, but the idea was, going back to the 1980s, to escape the hegemony or the predominance of the United States dictating everything by controlling a world of oil and gas internationally, the superpower, to have direct connection with Russia. Number two, and they were warned about this, that this wouldn't be reliable. It was their special connection. In oil, for example, they were the only country that had this direct pipeline connection to Russia that helped them in some way escape the vicissitudes of the Middle East. So it was a conscious plan. But what happened is it became obvious that after all those gas pipelines were built in the 1980s, that around 2000, after Mr. Putin came, that there were going to be big problems with the countries in the East, countries like Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine. And what my research has showed by talking to business and officials in Germany is that they consciously wanted to build new pipelines to escape exactly what's happening now. They were afraid of wars and so forth, and so that's why they wanted to, Putin does it for his own reason, build detour pipelines. Their policy their brilliant idea has collapsed. They weren't able to find a special sort of escape. And it's a big failure for Germany's geostrategy right now. And everyone's taking the consequences of it.
Yeah, so what's the solution then? How do you make up that kind of shortfall? We talk about Germany because Germany has the biggest dependence. It certainly uses the most amount of Russian gas. I mean, what happens if the Russians turn the tap off now?
It's very serious. There's two scenarios to look at. There's if this goes away gradually, and the EU will, Forster or Germany will also agree to go away slowly from Russian gas, then it'll be mostly market mechanisms with some intervention of the state. But if it was cut off totally tomorrow by Russia, what would happen is there's a plan that the Americans were working on 2 months before the war started. You can look back. There was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal praising this program a month before the war started, that it had already been going on for a month. And that was something they call a gas airlift, something analogous to what happened in the Berlin airlift in 1949 when Stalin cut off Berlin. It's that they have been going systematically, and now that the EU sees this is happening, the EU diplomats are going systematically to Asian allies, asking our allies to sacrifice the delivery of LNG and divert it to Europe as the necessity arises. They're also acting very intensively in North Africa to try and bring more, and with Qatar and so forth, to bring more LNG. In the short run, if this happens, new renewables is not going to get it. It has to be LNG. It would, if it was cut off, it'd be a very difficult winter. But with this plan, at least we would get through the winter and into the next year, start to actually get enough supplies. There's plenty of LNG. There's plenty of gas in the world. It has to be developed.
Okay, let me come back to you then, Paul Ekins. If the tap gets turned off, then it's going to be hard for. Well, it's going to be hard for a couple of years. It's going to be hard for a couple of years anyway. But is there an argument that countries should start working now on means to become self-sufficient when it comes to energy generation? And the obvious question would be, why haven't we been doing the renewable, really ramping up the renewable process before?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's a real shame that it's taken us a war, really, to appreciate the importance of renewables. I'm staggered that we can ramp it up and accelerate it, because the threat coming from the climate crisis should have been absolutely enough for us to be going towards renewables as fast as we possibly could. But it's now clear that that wasn't the case. Of course, as Thomas says, it's going to take time to ramp that up. And in the short term, we should be giving much more attention to energy efficiency and to reducing demand. Generally, a lot of the energy use that we have in the rich world, in Europe, in the United States, is discretionary. It's not absolutely necessary. And I would hope that our governments are putting in place a kind of rationing mechanism so that when the winter comes, if we are very short of gas, we can have some mechanism to channel the gas that we need to the people who really need it and the industries that really need it, so that discretionary use is cut back, to give time to get more renewables on the system. I mean, renewables don't take as long as nuclear power, for example, but they do take they do take months or years actually to get on stream. And we ought to be giving much more attention to energy efficiency and demand reduction.
Well, what do you think has been the reluctance behind that reluctance from governments to actually start ramping this up? Climate scientists, as you say, have been sounding the alarm for quite some time now. And even now that there's this energy crisis, which most people in Europe are now living through, it still seems that governments are not getting a move on and starting to get more renewables online. Why is that?
Well, my perception is it is quite simply that governments are not yet perceiving the climate crisis to be the crisis that it is.
Maria, you're in Germany, which of course has had a lot of influence from Green politicians over the last few years. In fact, the Greens were, as part of their coalition demands, was to phase out coal-fired power stations and nuclear and so on and so forth. Given the influence of these Green politicians, why do you think there hasn't been more of a push for renewables and everything's been geared towards Russian gas?
In German case, I think it is safe to say that the access to relatively cheap Russian pipeline gas that has been there, in fact, for decades since the Soviet times, has gotten the German government a bit relaxed. And this notion of gas as a transition fuel has been very much in the German discourse. This has changed now dramatically. And given that there has been this access to a relatively lower carbon emitting fuel compared to coal or oil, the ruling coalition, which has up until now never been the Greens, it's been the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, has always said, we have enough time. We now have access to our wonderful transition fuel. So let's take it in an orderly manner. This has been a huge strategic mistake, I would say, and this is now being redeemed by, first of all, some regulatory measures that help to accelerate the deployment of renewables in Germany. It has, on average, taken up to 7 years from the conception stage to actually launching a solar wind power farm in Germany, and this has been also the case in Europe altogether. And this regulatory blockage needed to be lifted, and it will be now lifted. If I may go beyond Germany a little bit, then I'd actually contradict a little bit to what Paul just said on the politicians not being ready to react to the climate crisis and all the multiple crises that we are now reliving, which are exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. The European Union, in fact, is now coming forward with a stronger European strategy on decarbonizing its energy systems and not just getting off its dependence on Russian gas, but also dependence on fossil fuel imports altogether. The Repower EU, which will be released next week. And we know that energy efficiency and acceleration of renewables deployment play a very key role in there. Of course, alternative LNG supplies too, but this is, at least on the European level, this is seen as the short-term measure. And when we're looking at the global LNG market, which is now tight, we also have to admit that any new LNG capacity, if planned now, won't come online in the next until in the next 5 to 7 years, because it always takes time to build the new LNG infrastructure, new exploration infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So I actually dependent on the LNG we have now in the market, and it is enough. But it is only enough if the EU really prioritizes the efficiency measures, prioritizes energy savings, and prioritizes the acceleration of renewables measures.
And do you get the sense that the European governments are doing that? Do you get the sense that they're united on this? Because in Europe, as we know, you've just talked to yourself about timescales of 7 years or more. It's difficult to get 27 countries all to agree to something. I mean, is that enough? Is the urgency there, or is this something that's just going to get kicked into the long grass again, and we're just going to start seeing more of a reliance on things like coal?
The urgency is really there, I would say. And the thing is that Europe doesn't really have a choice now between relying more on coal or alternative gas supplies or accelerating its energy transition, because reliance on coal or alternative gas supplies would really mean reliance on extremely expensive fossil fuels that are also volatile, and means basically undermining its own competitiveness as an industrial and tech powerhouse. So accelerating the transition is the only strategic choice that you can make now. And from what we have seen from the first draft of the Repower EU strategy that has come out in March this year, the actions that we'll be taking starting next week are quite decisive.
Let me come to you now, Thomas O'Donnell. We've been very focused on Germany and on the EU and Europe, but they're not the only ones buying gas. They're not the only ones buying gas and oil. And if the EU is leveraging its muscle and cornering as much of the LNG market as it can, what does that do to other countries who are also trying to fire their power stations? And for poorer countries, or those who are not in a block with that kind of international heft, where does that leave them?
Exactly. This is a major problem. India and China massively turned to coal. If the EU can wrest LNG away from North Africa, away from the United States, well, India was starting to, and China, starting to massively import LNG to replace coal. It'll just be shifted around. I mean, a lot of them are shifted around. I think there's a problem with and you could call it the German model if you like, but there is this idea that renewables, 100% of just renewables, sort of renewables fundamentalism, no nuclear, all fossil fuels are the same. That's the policy, the German policy, essentially. And I look at before the war, before the, even sort of right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, there is a report every year commissioned by the parliament here, the 8th monitoring report that looked over the German energy vendor transition. The monitors, the independent monitors said it will not be possible to power Germany solely on domestic renewables, period. And we have to go to other countries and somehow get our companies to go and invest in other countries and bring the renewable energy home. But somehow we've got to change the rules so that the carbon credits can come back home too. So they're starting the same kind of competition for renewables. This was its renewables fundamentalism. They closed 17 nuclear plants here. Okay, that was about, I calculate about 60% of the energy they get from all the renewables in Germany on an average year, basically. Why? It's an ideological problem. The model is a broken, it's not a broken model. They also put natural gas on the level, as Maria pointed out. When you ask them why haven't you used LNG for heavy trucking and for buses, 8 years ago, I asked the leadership of the Green Party, and they said, in 10 years, we'll have 100% electric. Well, there's been no change. It's an unrealistic model. Anyway, it's an anti-scientific model, in my opinion.
Okay, but do you see that Germany is at least trying to move things around? I'm very conscious that we're getting back onto Germany again, and it does strike me that there is a wider crisis that all people are facing. I'm going to come back to you, Paul Ekins, because we find ourselves in this situation. Many people start by saying, well, could this war in Ukraine be the catalyst that drives a more greener approach to energy? Do you see that as happening? Do you think we're going to start seeing this shift? Everyone's going to have a windmill in their back garden? Or is it more complex than that?
Energy is always complex, and any simple solution is likely to be wrong. But I do think that there will be a greater push to renewables across Europe and in the wider world. I mean, the fact of the matter is the costs have come down very greatly, and a lot of electricity systems can take a lot more renewables. We're a long way to the kind of 100% renewable systems that Tom is talking about. And pretty well all the systems. I mean, the UK is a leader in renewables in many ways, but we've still only got 40% on a good day. And we can expect further cost reductions. We can expect further cost reductions also in storage that will help balance the times when the renewables are not available. And so I think there's a long way to go down that track still. And for many countries, that is the economic way to go, as well as the energy secure way to go. So I think it will get a big boost, certainly if fossil fuel prices stay anything like at their present level.
And if they come down again? Is that the worry that we could go backwards?
Again, of course, if a lot of the renewables have been built, then we know that the marginal cost, the operating cost of renewables is very, very low indeed. So then it's certainly going to be worth using them. I agree with Thomas that I think it was a strategic mistake to close all those nuclear power stations early. But certainly when it comes to new nuclear, that is extremely expensive if the UK experience is anything to go by. And renewables are probably half the cost. And therefore, we should be, in the short term, maximizing efficiency and demand reduction. In the medium term, be building lots more renewable capacity. And at the same time, be doing what we can to build up the possibilities for electricity storage. And I think that by the time we get to 2035, 2040, that will have transformed the electricity systems around the world. We may not be 100%. I frankly don't care whether we're 100% or 80%. That's an awful lot better than we are at the moment. And we will always need some balancing plant to iron out the intermittency and the variability of some renewables.
Okay, we only have a minute or two left, so I just want to ask all of you very quickly in one sentence, if you could. Are you optimistic as we look ahead when it comes to energy generation in the aftermath of this crisis in Ukraine and with the climate crisis, which is always looming large? Do you take an optimistic or a pessimistic view moving forwards? Maria Pastukhova.
Well, it depends, right? First of all, I think what we need to understand is when we are talking about moving to overly renewables-based energy systems, we're not talking about replacing 1 gigawatt of coal or gas power generation by 1 gigawatt of equivalent renewables. We're talking about the larger change of the whole economic system, about change of the energy consumption patterns, and the change in the flexibility of the system. This is a really fundamental shift that needs to happen in Europe and globally.
Okay, and Thomas O'Donnell, what's your view?
In the United States, we had under Obama, and it was continued. There's a policy called all of the above. And I think that's a pragmatic policy. I'm all for renewables. Depending on the sophistication of the grid and how much money and tech level, a country can build 25% renewables, maybe even Germany could do 50%, but then you've got to totally redo the grid. It's extremely expensive. You have to have some generalizable grid scale storage. It simply doesn't exist in the world. That's what they need natural gas for, to back up windmills and solar.
And just finally, in 1 or 2 words, if you could, Professor Paul Ekins, optimistic or pessimistic as we move forward with this crisis?
Well, we have to be optimistic or we don't get out of bed in the morning. So while the possibility remains that we are going to address this crisis, we've got to be optimistic that we both can and will do it.
We are out of time. I would like to thank all of you for taking part in this fascinating discussion. It's been great to have you all on. And remember, you can see more debate and discussion on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and the whole team here, it's goodbye and thank you for watching.